The research vessel Harmonious Discovery shuddered as it dropped out of faster-than-light travel, its hull groaning with the transition back into normal space. On the observation deck, Dr. Zilara Kess stood with 4 of her 6 legs pressed against the viewing port, her compound eyes reflecting the distant planet that hung in the void like a bruised jewel, swirls of violet and gray clouds choking an atmosphere that promised only death. She had reviewed the mission brief 17 times during the 3-week journey. Zilara was nothing if not thorough, a trait that had earned her this assignment despite her youth. At only 32 cycles, she was the youngest xenoarchaeologist ever selected for a deep space expedition by the Galactic Historical Preservation Society. Her specialization was human colonial history, specifically the failed colonies of humanity's desperate expansion era 2 centuries prior, when Earth's most ambitious generation had flung themselves at the stars with more hope than sense. Kepler 442d. The humans who crashed here had nicknamed it the Crucible in their final transmissions, though Zilara suspected they had no idea how prophetic that name would prove. The planet rotated below, and she recited the facts like a meditation, finding comfort in data the way her species always had. Mass, 2.3 times Earth standard. Surface gravity, 1.8 g, enough to crush most species' internal organs within weeks. Atmospheric pressure at sea level, 2.4 bars, requiring constant pressurization for human habitation. Wind speeds during storm season. Sustained velocities exceeding 400 kilometers per hour, with gusts measured at over 600. Native megafauna. Apex predators evolved in high gravity with armor plating, pack hunting behavior, and aggression levels that would make Earth's extinct theropods seem docile. Flora. Containing glycosides similar to cyanide, rendering most plant life toxic to human consumption without extensive processing. Tectonic activity. Significant, with seismic events registering 6 or higher occurring monthly. The conclusion was inescapable, written in bold letters across every scientific assessment, unsuitable for colonization by any known species. Habitability Index, 0.02 out of 10. The human colony ship Tomorrow's Hope had crashed here 197 standard years ago with just over 10,000 colonists aboard. Their distress beacon had functioned for 3 months before falling silent. The galactic community, in its early and uncertain relationship with humanity, had dispatched 2 rescue missions. Both had turned back after orbital surveys confirmed what everyone already knew. No one could survive down there. The gravity alone would have killed them. If not that, the storms. If not the storms, the predators. If not the predators, starvation when their supplies ran out and they discovered every plant on the planet was poison. The incident had been filed away as a tragedy, one of dozens from humanity's reckless expansion period. The galaxy had moved on. But the Galactic Historical Preservation Society never forgot, and now, 2 centuries later, Zilara had come to document the ruins, to collect artifacts, to piece together how the colonists had spent their final days before the Crucible claimed them all. She was reviewing the planned survey pattern when the ship's sensors began chiming in a pattern that made no sense. Captain Thoris Ven's voice crackled through the ship's communication system, his Korvax accent making the human words sound sharp and bitten. "Dr. Kess, report to the bridge immediately." Zilara scuttled through the corridors, her climbing claws finding easy purchase on the textured walls. The Harmonious Discovery was designed for multi-species comfort, which meant it was perfectly comfortable for no one, but the Iravani had evolved as arboreal creatures before developing sapience, and she navigated the 3-dimensional space with practiced ease. The bridge was already crowded when she arrived. Captain Ven stood at the center, his scales displaying the gray-green of confusion, an emotion Korvax rarely admitted to feeling. Around him, the rest of the small crew huddled over sensor displays, mandibles and tentacles and manipulator appendages all gesturing at screens that showed readings that couldn't possibly be correct. "Explain to me," Ven said without preamble, his vertical pupils narrowing to slits, Why my sensors are detecting active power signatures on the surface. Zilara felt her thorax tighten. The crash site would still have some power cells. The ship's reactor, if it didn't breach, could theoretically— Not a dying reactor, interrupted Xyloth, the ship's Thanari sensor operator, her vocal membrane vibrating with agitation. Multiple signatures, distributed across a 200-kilometer radius, and Doctor, we're detecting organized settlements, agricultural zones, what appears to be a spaceport. The bridge fell silent except for the ambient hum of the ship's systems. Zilara's mind raced through possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. Automated systems. Running for 2 centuries in this environment. Another species had colonized the planet. Impossible, the conditions would kill them too. Sensor malfunction on multiple independent systems. There's more, Xyloth continued, her membrane fluttering with what Zilara had learned to recognize as the Thanari equivalent of nervous laughter. Biosignatures, thousands of them. Large mammalian patterns consistent with human life. That's impossible, Ven stated flatly. Run a full diagnostic on all sensor arrays. They ran the diagnostics. Every system reported perfect functionality. They ran the scans again. The results didn't change. Finally, Ven ordered a high-altitude flyover. The ship descended through the violent upper atmosphere, and Zilara watched the viewscreen as the planet's surface resolved from abstract data into concrete reality. And reality was impossible. Cities rose from canyon walls, their architecture unlike anything in the galactic database. Structures that seemed to breathe, massive domed buildings with surfaces that rippled and flexed like living tissue. Agricultural terraces carved into cliff faces that should have been unclimbable. Roads that wound through terrain that would challenge military-grade vehicles. And everywhere, movement. Creatures the size of earth elephants but built low and broad with 6 legs and armored hides, walked with ponderous grace through the settlements. And on their backs, guiding them with apparent ease, were humans. Zilara watched a group of human children, playing in what the sensors said was 1.8 G gravity, running and jumping as though it were nothing, as though their bones weren't slowly crushing under their own weight, as though their hearts weren't laboring to pump blood upward against the relentless pull. I'm receiving a transmission, Xyloth announced, her voice barely above a whisper. Audio only, human language English variant. Play it, Ven ordered. The voice that filled the bridge was warm, female, tinged with amusement. Welcome to New Hope. Please land at coordinates XXYY. We've been expecting visitors eventually. Mind the wind shear on approach. It's a gentle day, but she still bites. The transmission ended. Everyone on the bridge turned to look at Zilara, as though her specialization in human history could possibly explain what they were seeing. But she had no explanation. She had only questions, and a growing sense that everything she thought she knew about her field of study was about to be overturned. The landing was an ordeal. Even with inertial dampeners at maximum, Zilara felt her internal organs shift uncomfortably as the ship settled onto the landing pad. An actual, purpose-built landing pad with proper heat shielding and guidance lights. She and 4 others suited up in exo-frames, powered armor that would support their bodies against the gravity, and descended the ramp with the tentative steps of creatures entering an alien world. Except this was supposed to be a human world, and humans were supposed to be dead. The woman waiting for them stood without any visible support equipment, her body relaxed in a gravity that should have been crushing her. She was tall by human standards, broad-shouldered, with dark skin and hair pulled back in a practical bun. She wore simple clothing, woven fabric, locally produced by the look of it, and she smiled at them with the easy confidence of someone greeting expected guests. "Dr. Zilara Kess," she asked, pronouncing the Iravani name with only slight difficulty. "I'm Dr. Meghna Chen, Chief Liaison for New Hope. Welcome to the Crucible." Zilara tried to speak and found her translator struggling to process her own shock into coherent language. Finally, she managed. "You're alive." Meghna's smile widened. "Very much so. I know you came expecting ruins and remains. Sorry to disappoint." She gestured to a waiting vehicle, low and broad, built for the gravity. "We've prepared accommodations for your team. I imagine you have questions." "That," Captain Ven said, his exoframe whirring with each movement, is an understatement of cosmic proportions. They were transported to what Makna called the Welcome Center, a building carved partially into the canyon wall with a transparent dome that gave a panoramic view of the settlement. Through the dome, Zilara watched humans move about their business, carrying loads that should have required powered equipment, working construction on buildings 3 stories tall, herding those massive creatures with nothing but vocal commands and confident gestures. Some of the humans looked different. Not drastically, not enough to be called another species, but enough that Zilara's trained eye caught the variations. Broader builds, deeper chests, bone structure that seemed denser, more robust. They moved with a grace that spoke of perfect adaptation to the gravity, while baseline humans Zilara had met before always seemed slightly uncomfortable in their own bodies, as though evolution hadn't quite finished its work. Makna served them beverages. Safe for most common physiologies, she assured them. We've had to become excellent xenobiologists and settled into a chair designed for human proportions. She waited patiently while they struggled with furniture that wasn't quite right for any of their body plans. I understand you're confused, Makna began. You came to study a dead colony. I suggest we reframe. You're here to study a living one. How we survived, how we adapted, how we built all this. She gestured to the settlement beyond the dome. That's still your area of expertise, isn't it, Dr. Kess? Zilara found her voice, her translator catching the rapid flutter of her mandibles. The records say 10,000 colonists crashed here. The survival rate given the conditions should have been 0 within 6 months. That was the consensus of every environmental assessment team. The consensus was correct, Makna said quietly. It should have been 0. For any reasonable species it would have been 0. She paused and something shifted in her expression. A shadow of old pain carefully compartmentalized. 2,000 died in the crash. 3,000 more in the first year. Gravity-related organ failure mostly. Some storms, predator attacks, poisoning from trying to eat local flora. The second year was worse. We lost another 2,000. By the end of year 3, we were down to 1,800 survivors. The numbers hit Zilara like a physical blow. 1,800 from 10,000, an 82% mortality rate. Why didn't you signal for rescue? Ven demanded. Surely, our communications array was destroyed in the crash. We tried rebuilding it, but the atmospheric interference is significant and we didn't have the materials. Makna's voice remained level, matter-of-fact, as though reciting weather data rather than describing the death of thousands. By the time we might have succeeded, we'd already adapted enough that leaving seemed counterproductive. Counterproductive, Zilara repeated. You chose to stay here. Why don't I show you around? Makna suggested, rising with fluid ease that made Zilara's exoframe feel clumsy and crude. Understanding is easier with context. The tour began with what Makna called the storm walls. The settlement was built in a canyon system, Zilara realized, using the natural geography as the first line of defense. But the walls weren't solid barriers. They were flexible structures that seemed to be made from a composite material, possibly including local resources, engineered to bend rather than break. Resisting the storms killed us the first decade, Makna explained as they walked along the base of one wall. Above them, it curved gracefully upward, following the canyon's contours. Every time we tried to build solid structures, the wind crushed them or tore them apart. We lost people in collapses, people who were sheltering in what they thought were safe buildings. Eventually, we stopped trying to fight the planet and started trying to understand it. She led them to a demonstration area where a scale model of the wall system showed how wind was redirected, channeled, even harvested for power. The storms come from the west during prime season, following the thermal patterns from the larger ocean. We learned to predict them, then to use them. These walls generate about 40% of our power needs. You're telling me, Ven said slowly, his scales shifting to a brown of deep skepticism, that your ancestors, dying and desperate, paused long enough to study meteorology. No, Makna corrected gently. We're telling you that our ancestors were desperate enough to try anything, including things that seemed insane. The storm wall concept came from a second-generation engineer who'd grown up here. She didn't know it was impossible because she'd never lived anywhere else. Their next stop was the render pens. Zilara had seen the creatures from the air, but up close they were even more imposing. 3 meters at the shoulder, 6 legs ending in claws that could shred steel, armored plates covering their backs and flanks, and jaws that looked designed to crush anything stupid enough to challenge them. The Galactic database had classified them as apex predators, unsurvivable for any colonization attempt. And here, a human child no more than 8 years old was feeding one by hand. The render took the offered food, some kind of local plant matter, with surprising delicacy, its massive head lowering to the child's level. The girl scratched behind what Zilara supposed was its ear, and the creature made a rumbling sound that might have been contentment. We call them renders because the first few we encountered rendered several people into component parts, Makna said, and there was a dark humor in her voice that Zilara was beginning to recognize as a human defense mechanism. Took 3 generations and a lot of deaths to domesticate them. Turns out they're pack animals. We just had to prove we were worth joining the pack. How? Zilara asked. How do you prove that to something that can kill you in seconds? Carefully, Makna replied. And with the understanding that some of us wouldn't survive the attempt. But renders are incredibly strong, perfectly adapted to the gravity and terrain. They can go places our vehicles can't, carry loads that would require heavy machinery on other worlds. The calculations were brutal but simple. More of us would die if we didn't have them than if we tried to domesticate them. She paused, watching the child and the render with an expression that Zilara couldn't quite parse. The breakthrough came when we realized they imprint on young. We started raising render hatchlings alongside human children. Growing up together, they bonded. That girl you're watching, she's 4th-generation Crucible born. She's never known a world where renders were enemies. To her, that's just Chomper, her best friend who happens to weigh 4 tons. They moved on to the agricultural terraces, carved into cliff faces at angles that made Zilara's spatial reasoning struggle. The crops growing there were clearly derived from Earth species. She recognized the genetic markers of wheat, rice, and various vegetables. But they'd been modified extensively, their root structures deeper and more robust, their cellular walls thicker. The local flora is toxic, Makna explained, running her hand along a terrace wall. Contains glycosides that interrupt cellular respiration in most Earth organisms. First 2 years, we lost people to accidental poisoning, desperation eating, even cross-contamination of our hydroponic gardens. We had to figure out how to make Earth crops survive here while avoiding local plants entirely. Genetic modification, Zilara asked. You had that capability after a crash. Eventually. Initially, we just planted seeds and saw what survived. Artificial selection on a timescale that would make Earth's agricultural revolution look slow. The gravity, the soil composition, the radiation levels, everything here is wrong for Earth plants. But some mutated, adapted, survived. We saved those seeds, planted them, selected again. 20 generations of crops in 20 years. The people doing that work knew they probably wouldn't live to taste the results. They did it anyway. Makna led them to a memorial garden, a quiet space in the heart of the settlement where names were carved into stone tablets. Thousands of names. Zilara stood in silence, reading the dates. Most of the deaths clustered in the first 5 years, but there were names from every year since the crash. We don't forget the cost, Makna said softly. Every person here can trace their family history back to multiple deaths in those first years. My own great-grandmother survived, but her husband and 2 children didn't. She lived another 40 years, helped develop the first successful crop strains, and never spoke about the early days without crying. We have a saying here, remember the wait. It means remember what we paid to be here. That evening, they were invited to the home of Elder James Okonkwo, one of the oldest surviving colonists. His dwelling was carved partially into the canyon wall, using the natural stone as insulation and structure. Inside, it was warm and surprisingly comfortable, decorated with an eclectic mix of salvaged Earth technology and locally crafted items. The elder himself was a surprise. At 83 standard years, he should have been frail, possibly using assistance devices. Instead, he moved with the careful but confident gait of someone who knew exactly what their body could do. His bone structure was notably denser than baseline human, his frame broader. He'd been 7 years old when the ship crashed, part of the last generation to remember Earth. He served them food, carefully prepared to be compatible with multiple biochemistries, and settled into a chair that showed decades of use. His eyes, cloudy with age but still sharp, studied each of them in turn. "You want to know how we survived," he said. It wasn't a question. Everyone does. The answer is simple and terrible. We chose to. We chose to survive even when survival seemed impossible, even when it might have been kinder to give up. That choice defined us. He began to speak, and Zilara recorded every word, knowing she was hearing living history. The first year had been hell. The crash had destroyed most of their equipment, killed their leadership, and scattered survivors across a kilometer of rough terrain. They'd salvaged what they could, but the planet had immediately begun its work. The gravity crushed the elderly and the infirm first. Their hearts simply couldn't pump blood upward anymore. Their bones cracked under loads they'd carried all their lives. The young children adapted fastest, their bones still growing, their bodies plastic enough to respond to the new environment. Storm season hit 3 months after the crash. They'd built shelters using prefabricated materials from the ship, following standard colonial engineering. The winds had torn those shelters apart like paper, killing 17 people in one night. The survivors had crawled into natural caves, pressed themselves into crevices in the rock, and learned their first lesson. The Crucible didn't care about human engineering standards. The renders had found them 6 months in. A pack of 30 had surrounded the main camp, and the humans had tried to fight them off with improvised weapons and the handful of working firearms they'd salvaged. They'd killed 3 renders. The renders had killed 22 humans before withdrawing, apparently deciding the strange soft creatures weren't worth the effort. Food had been the next crisis. Their supplies would last maybe 18 months if carefully rationed. The hydroponic gardens failed, power fluctuations from damaged systems, contamination from local spores, and simple inexperience. They'd tried eating local plants. The first person to try had died in convulsions within an hour. They'd tried hunting local fauna. Most was toxic, some wasn't, but catching it was nearly impossible. "We had a meeting," Elder Okonkwo said, his voice distant with memory. "About 8 months after the crash, we'd lost almost half our people. We were starving, the storms were getting worse, and someone suggested that maybe we should just stop, build one last shelter, gather everyone inside and seal it. Make it quick and painless instead of drawn-out suffering." Paused, and Zilara realized everyone in the room had stopped breathing. "We took a vote. It was close. Closer than anyone likes to remember. But the majority voted to keep trying. I was a child. I didn't get a vote, but I remember my mother's face when the results came in. She'd voted to live. And she'd promised that if we were going to live, we were going to do it properly. Not as Earth humans trying to survive on a hostile world, but as Crucible humans learning to live on our world." That vote, that choice, had changed everything. They'd stopped trying to replicate Earth solutions and started observing the planet. They'd studied the native life, how the renders moved in the gravity, how local plants handled the storms, how cave-dwelling species weathered the pressure changes. They'd experimented, failed, learned, and tried again. The render domestication had started with a desperate gambit by a xenobiologist named Sarah Tanaka, who noticed that young renders stayed close to their mothers for an extended period. She proposed capturing eggs, raising the young in isolation, imprinting them on humans. The community had argued for weeks. Resources were already stretched thin, and raising creatures that might grow up to kill them seemed insane. But Tanaka had pointed out that renders were the apex predators for a reason. They thrived here. If humans could partner with them instead of fighting them, it could change everything. She died when the first hatchling matured and turned on its handlers, killing 3 people before being put down. But the second group of hatchlings, raised with even more care, with human children as companions from the moment they emerged from their eggs, had bonded successfully. That was 40 years ago, and now renders were as integral to Crucible society as dogs had once been to Earth cultures. The crops had been solved through brutal necessity and thousands of failed experiments. They'd planted anything that might grow, crossbred wildly, exposed seeds to local conditions, and saved anything that survived. The breakthrough had come from understanding the local soil composition and engineering earth plants to process it. A botanist named Marcus Ose I had spent 15 years on the project, going blind from close work in poor lighting conditions, but his final strain of crucible wheat had saved them. The architecture had evolved from failure. Every building that fell taught them something. Eventually, they developed the flexible, organic structures Zilara had seen, part salvaged earth materials, part local resources, part inspired intuition about how to work with the planet rather than against it. What you have to understand, Elder Okonkwo said, his eyes focusing back on the present, is that we didn't overcome the crucible. We became part of it. Every human born here in the last century has adapted. We're stronger, denser, more resilient than baseline humans. Our children grow up in this gravity. To them, it's normal. We can process trace amounts of local toxins that would kill visitors. Our lungs handle the atmospheric pressure without equipment. We're still human, we can have children with baseline humans, our DNA is compatible, but we're also crucible people. This planet tried to kill us. We took it personally and decided to thrive instead. He smiled then, a fierce expression full of pride. You came here thinking you'd find failure. What you found is humanity being human. We adapt, we survive, we take the impossible and make it routine. That's not special to us, that's what our species has always done. Earth was an ice age, then a desert, then a jungle, then an ocean. We lived in all of it. The crucible is just another environment, and we're just another generation of humans refusing to die when it would be more convenient. The storm hit on their 5th day in New Hope. Zilara had been reviewing her notes when the alarm sounded, not a panic signal, but a steady, informative tone that suggested routine procedure rather than emergency. Through the windows of her accommodation, she saw humans moving with practiced efficiency, securing equipment, herding renders toward reinforced shelters, guiding children indoors. Captain Venn appeared at her door, his exoframe showing stress indicators from days of constant use in the high gravity. The locals say it's a major storm, Category 5 by galactic standards. I'm ordering evacuation to orbit. The humans are staying, Zilara observed. The humans are insane, Venn countered. We're not. We're leaving. But Makna had other ideas. She arrived with a small group, all moving with the confident ease of people in their native environment, and politely but firmly insisted that evacuation was unnecessary and that the research team would be perfectly safe in the storm shelters. You'll want to see this, she said to Zilara. You came to understand how we live here. This is how we live here. The storm shelter was carved deep into the canyon wall, reinforced with materials Zilara couldn't immediately identify, possibly render bone, based on the structural analysis, combined with something that looked like local stone but had been processed to increase its density. The interior was spacious enough for several hundred people, with supplies, medical facilities, and, surprisingly, large transparent sections that provided views of the canyon. Zilara's team huddled in their exoframes, clustered near the center of the shelter, while humans went about routine activities around them, children playing, adults cooking, elders telling stories. The contrast was jarring. The aliens, wrapped in powered armor, treating this as a crisis. The humans, in everyday clothes, treating it as an inconvenience. Then the storm arrived. Zilara had reviewed the meteorological data. She'd read the reports. She'd seen the numbers. But data didn't capture the visceral reality of a crucible storm. The wind hit the canyon like a physical entity, and even through the thick walls of the shelter, Zilara heard its roar. The transparent sections showed a world gone mad, visibility reduced to meters, debris flying at speeds that would shred unprotected flesh, lightning arcing between clouds and canyon walls with energy outputs that rivaled small explosions. And then she saw them. Humans. Outside. On renderback, securing final structures, moving through the wind with practiced efficiency. They wore protective gear, but nothing like the heavy armor Zilara's team required. They were exposed to conditions that would kill most sapient species in minutes. One rider's render lost its footing on the slick stone. The human fell, tumbling in the gravity and wind that should have been lethal. The render caught its rider with one massive claw, gentle despite its strength, and the human remounted. They continued their work. Zilara felt something break inside her. The fear, the impossibility, the sheer wrongness of what she was witnessing. It overwhelmed her carefully maintained scientific detachment. Her breathing accelerated, her internal spiracles struggling to process air through the exoframe's filters. She was hyperventilating, panic setting in, and she couldn't stop it. Maikna appeared beside her, moving with that uncanny grace. She didn't try to stop Zilara's panic, didn't offer platitudes. She simply sat, her presence calm and grounded, and waited. Eventually, Zilara's breathing slowed. Her rational mind reasserted control. She looked at Maikna through her helmet's display and asked the question that had been building since they'd arrived. Why not just die? Why suffer so much to live here? Maikna was quiet for a long moment, watching the storm rage outside. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful, choosing words carefully. Because we're human. Because giving up isn't in our species' vocabulary. Because every human alive today exists because our ancestors survived impossible odds. Ice ages, plagues, wars, famines, predators that hunted us, environments that tried to kill us. We're not stronger than other species, not smarter, not better, but we're stubborn. We're adaptable. And we have this strange quality where when something tries to kill us, we take it as a personal challenge. She gestured to the storm outside. The Crucible tried to kill us. It killed thousands of us. It still kills some of us. See those memorial tablets being carved. Those are from last year's storm season. 3 deaths, all accidents, all preventable, all mourned. But we're still here. And our children and our children's children will be here long after we're gone, living lives they find completely normal on a world the galaxy says is uninhabitable. Doesn't it frighten you? Zilara asked. One accident away from death all the time. Of course, Maikna said simply. We're not fearless. We're just more afraid of giving up than we are of dying. There's a difference. The storm lasted 18 hours. When it finally cleared, Zilara emerged from the shelter to find the settlement battered but intact. Repairs were already underway. And to her utter incomprehension, there was music playing, people dancing, children laughing. Storm festivals, Maikna explained. We celebrate survival. Every storm we weather is a victory. Life here is hard, Dr. Kess. If we didn't celebrate the good moments, the weight of the hard ones would crush us worse than the gravity. Captain Venn called a meeting with New Hope's governing council the next day. He'd spent the storm composing a formal proposal. The galaxy should know they'd survived. There would be trade opportunities, technology exchange, contact with other human colonies, medical support. The Crucible settlement could be integrated into the galactic community, receive supplies, even evacuate anyone who wanted to leave. The council listened politely. Then they politely declined. We appreciate the offer, the council's spokeswoman said, a 4th-generation Crucible human with bone structure that marked her as thoroughly adapted. We'll welcome visitors, trade, cultural exchange, but we're not leaving. This is our home. We're Crucible people. We've been here for 200 years. Our ancestors' bones are in this soil. Our history is carved into these canyons. Why would we leave? Venn clearly wanted to argue what rational being would choose to stay in such conditions. But Zilara touched his arm, stopping him. She was beginning to understand. For the next week, Zilara conducted detailed studies. She collected genetic samples with permission and confirmed what she'd suspected. The Crucible humans showed rapid evolutionary adaptation. Not enough to be considered a subspecies, but significant variations. Bone density 40% higher than baseline human. Lung capacity increased by 30%. Enhanced metabolic processing. Cardiovascular systems that handled the gravity with minimal strain. Psychological profiles showing stress tolerance in the 99th percentile. She spent time with the children, the 4th and 5th generation colonists who'd never known Earth. They looked at images of baseline humans and found them fragile, strange. They watched videos of Earth gravity and thought it looked like flying. One child told her with perfect sincerity that renders were much better than dogs because dogs are too small to ride. Makna took her to a museum, and Zilara spent an entire day there recording everything. Original spacesuits, now unused because children grew up acclimated. Photos of the early dead, preserved not to depress but to honor. The last Earth meal, when they'd consumed the final rations from tomorrow's hope and committed themselves fully to Crucible resources. Video logs from desperate early years, raw and unedited, showing fear and determination in equal measure. And the wall of impossible. It was exactly what it sounded like. A display of every expert assessment, every scientific paper, every galactic consensus that had declared human survival on Kepler 442d impossible. Hundreds of documents. All wrong. We keep this, Makna said, to remind ourselves that impossible is an opinion, not a fact. On their final day before departure, Elder Okonkwo gave Zilara a gift, a seed from a crucible tree, one of the adapted species that grew in the canyon. It was contained in a small preservation chamber with a sample of crucible soil. Plant this in your lab, he said. Study it. Watch it grow in conditions it shouldn't survive. And remember that life finds a way, especially when it's human life. We're not special, Dr. Kess. We're just what happens when you tell any species they can't survive and give them no choice but to try anyway. The harmonious discovery broke orbit 3 days later. Zilara stood at the observation port, watching the Crucible recede, that bruised jewel of a planet that should have been a tomb but was instead a thriving home to thousands. Captain Ven joined her, his scales showing the blue-gray of deep contemplation. They're terrifying, he said quietly. Zilara considered this. No, she finally said. They're inspiring, and yes, also terrifying, but mostly, they're human. This is what humans do. They find a way. Her report to the Galactic Historical Preservation Society was 17,000 words long, accompanied by hundreds of hours of video documentation, genetic analyses, architectural surveys, and cultural assessments. Her conclusion shook the scientific community. Humanity does not terraform planets to suit their biology. They terraform themselves to suit the planet. Given sufficient time and motivation, humans can adapt to survive in virtually any environment. They don't conquer worlds in the traditional sense. They become part of them, evolving in real time across generations, accepting catastrophic losses as the cost of eventual adaptation. Recommendation: all previous assumptions about planetary habitability where humans are concerned must be revised. If humans can survive on Kepler 442d, they can survive almost anywhere. This has profound implications for understanding human expansion and the future of multi-species cooperation. Her report went viral across the galactic network. Other lost human colonies were checked. Some had indeed died as expected, but others, to everyone's shock, had survived against equally impossible odds. Humanity's reputation shifted from reckless expansionists to unkillable adapters. The change wasn't entirely comfortable for anyone involved. In her lab back at the university, Zilara planted the Crucible seed in its sample of impossible soil. She provided it with conditions that matched Kepler 442d as closely as she could recreate. High-gravity simulation, atmospheric pressure, even recorded audio of Crucible storms playing on loop. The seed sprouted. It grew. Against all reasonable biological expectations, fed by soil that should have been incompatible under conditions that should have been lethal, the small tree thrived. Zilara kept a journal, a personal log separate from her official research. On the night the tree produced its first leaves, she wrote, "I went to study how humans died on a death world. Instead, I learned how they chose to live. I expected to find failure and learned about determination. I thought I would document extinction and instead witnessed evolution. The Crucible should have killed them. They took it personally. What troubles me most is not that they survived. Adaptation is a universal principle of life. What troubles me is the cost they willingly paid. 1,800 survivors from 10,000 colonists. An 82% mortality rate that they remember, honor, and use as the foundation of their identity. They chose that cost. They looked at those odds and voted to keep trying. I've been trained to believe that sapience means rational calculation, means choosing the path of least harm, means acknowledging when a situation is untenable. But humans redefine untenable with every generation. What other species would call impossible, they call Tuesday. Captain Venn asked me if I thought we should warn the galaxy about humanity. I told him we should do the opposite. We should learn from them. Because the thing that makes humans terrifying is the same thing that makes them magnificent. They don't accept limits. They don't respect impossibility. They see a death world and call it home. The tree is growing. Against all logic, all probability, all scientific expectation, it's growing, just like they did. The difference, I now understand, is everything. 3 months after Zilara's report was published, the Galactic Council convened an emergency session. The topic: humanity's petition for expanded colonization rights. For decades, the Council had restricted human expansion, citing safety concerns and the numerous failed colonies. The Crucible report changed the conversation. Zilara was invited to present her findings in person. The council chambers were vast, designed to accommodate representatives from 247 species, each with their own environmental requirements. Zilara stood at the central podium, her presentation floating in holographic space around her, and faced the assembled representatives of galactic civilization. "Honored council members," she began, her translator rendering her Iravani speech patterns into the neutral lingua franca. "I was sent to document a failure. What I found challenges our fundamental understanding of habitability, adaptation, and the nature of sapient resilience." She displayed images of the Crucible, the violent storms, the crushing gravity, the hostile ecosystem. Then she showed new hope: thriving cities, agricultural abundance, children playing with domesticated apex predators. The question before this council is not whether humans can survive in harsh environments. The Crucible proves they can. The question is whether we, as a galactic community, understand what that means for our shared future. A Zilara counselor's membrane vibrated with skepticism. "Dr. Kess, your report documents an extraordinary circumstance but hardly representative. One successful adaptation doesn't establish a pattern." "With respect, counselor, it's not one." Zilara pulled up a new display. "Following publication of my report, 17 other human colonies classified as failed were resurveyed. 11 were indeed extinct as expected, but 6 had survived. I'll highlight just 3. Titan's Reach, orbiting a red dwarf with tidal locking. The colony landed on the terminator zone between eternal day and eternal night. Temperature fluctuations of 300 degrees. They survived by developing a nomadic culture, migrating in a continuous loop to stay in the habitable zone. Current population, 4,200. Deep Harbor, a world with 90% ocean coverage and frequent megastorms. They built floating cities that dive beneath the surface during storms. They've domesticated local aquatic species and developed gills through genetic modification. Current population, 8,900. New Sahara, a desert world with surface temperatures exceeding 60 degrees Celsius and almost no surface water. They live underground in cave systems, culture water-producing bacteria, and only surface at night. Current population, 3,100. The pattern, counselor, is clear. Humans don't survive by our standards, they redefine the standards. Another counselor, a Korvax military representative, spoke up. "This is precisely what concerns many of us, Doctor. If humans can adapt to any environment, if they refuse to accept natural limitations, what prevents them from expanding unchecked across the galaxy?" Zilara had anticipated this question. She'd spent weeks formulating her response. "What prevents them, counselor, is the same thing that saved them: community, cooperation, and the memory of cost. Every surviving human colony I studied maintains extensive memorials to their dead. They don't glorify suffering, they honor it and work to prevent it. The Crucible humans could have kept their survival techniques proprietary, could have claimed superiority over baseline humans or other species. Instead, they immediately offered to share everything they'd learned. Dr. Make Chen sent me a message last week. New Hope is developing a training program for anyone who wants to settle high-gravity worlds. They're not gatekeeping their knowledge, they're teaching it, because they remember what it cost to learn it alone. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. You ask what prevents humans from expanding unchecked. I would argue nothing does, and that's not the problem we think it is. Because wherever humans expand, they don't displace other species. They open new frontiers. They make uninhabitable worlds habitable. They take death worlds and turn them into homes. That doesn't threaten us. It gives us all more room to grow. The council chamber erupted in multilingual debate. Some councilors argued passionately for lifting human expansion restrictions. Others insisted on maintaining caution. The Thenari faction proposed a compromise. Allow human expansion to worlds already classified as uninhabitable for other species, essentially giving humanity the planets no one else wanted. The vote took 3 days. In the end, the compromise passed, but with an important addition proposed by a Iravani councilor who'd been moved by Zilara's testimony. Any human colony that successfully established itself on a previously uninhabitable world would receive galactic support and recognition. Humanity would no longer be punished for their adaptability, they would be celebrated for it. The announcement was broadcast across the galaxy. Response was mixed. Some species saw opportunity, worlds they'd written off might now have value. Others saw threat, a species that could live anywhere could go everywhere. But most saw what Zilara had seen, inspiration in the stubborn refusal to accept limits. On the Crucible, the announcement was met with quiet satisfaction. Elder Okonkwo, now 84 and still walking unassisted in 1.8G, was interviewed by Galactic Media. His response was quintessentially human. We didn't survive for recognition. We survived because the alternative was death and we were too stubborn to die. But if our experience helps others, human or alien, then those 1,800 graves mean something more. Every person we lost bought knowledge with their life. Seems wrong to keep that knowledge to ourselves. A year after Zilara's visit, the first official trade delegation arrived at New Hope. They came seeking not just cultural exchange, but practical knowledge. A Korvax military unit wanted to understand how humans trained renders. Their own attempts at domesticating high-gravity predators had failed. A Thenari agricultural collective wanted to learn the crop adaptation techniques. An Iravani medical team wanted to study the rapid evolutionary changes, hoping to apply similar principles to help their own species adapt to new environments. Make Chen, now officially appointed as the Crucible's galactic liaison, welcomed them all. She gave the same tour Zilara had received, told the same stories, showed the same memorials. But she added something new, a wall of photographs showing other human colonies, the ones that had failed and the ones that had succeeded. A reminder that survival was never guaranteed, that adaptation came at a cost, and that every success was built on a foundation of failures. The visitors asked the same questions Zilara had asked. Why stay? Why not leave for easier worlds? Why choose such hardship? And Makna gave them the same answer Elder Okonkwo had given. Because this is home. Because easy isn't the same as meaningful. Because our ancestors died to give us this place, and leaving would dishonor that sacrifice. Because when you've survived the impossible, everything else feels survivable too. One of the Korvax military observers, a young officer named Threx, spent 3 months on the Crucible as part of a cultural exchange. He lived in New Hope, experienced 2 storm seasons, worked alongside Crucible humans in their daily tasks, and even attempted, unsuccessfully but memorably, to ride a render. His final report to his superiors contained a section that was later widely quoted. I came to the Crucible believing humans were either extraordinarily lucky or delusionally stubborn. After 3 months, I understand they're neither. They're practical in ways we've forgotten how to be. They looked at an environment that should kill them and asked not, how do we survive this? But how do we use this? The storms generate power. The predators became partners. The toxic plants became medicine. The crushing gravity made them stronger. We call them Death Worlders. They call themselves Crucible people, and there's a difference in those names that matters. Death Worlders are defined by what kills them. Crucible people are defined by what they've overcome. I think the entire galaxy could learn from that distinction. Back in her laboratory, Zilara watched her crucible tree grow. It was now over a meter tall, its trunk thick and sturdy, its leaves a deep green that reminded her of the canyon forest she'd seen on her visit. She'd published 3 papers on its growth patterns, each one documenting adaptation processes that shouldn't work but did. She received a message from Makna. Heard about your tree. Glad it's thriving. We've been breeding seeds specifically for lower gravity environments. Thought you might want some for your research. Also, we're hosting a symposium next year on Death World adaptation techniques. You'd be the guest of honor if you're interested. Zilara accepted immediately. The symposium drew attendees from across the galaxy. Scientists, colonization specialists, military strategists, even artists and philosophers interested in the cultural implications of human adaptation. They gathered in New Hope's new conference facility, built using the same flexible architecture as the rest of the settlement, designed to accommodate multiple species' environmental needs. Zilara presented her ongoing research. Other researchers presented studies on the other surviving colonies. Human scientists from baseline colonies presented comparative analyses, but the most impactful presentations came from the Death World colonists themselves. A young woman from Deep Harbor, her neck showing the distinctive gill modifications, spoke about aquatic adaptation. We didn't choose to become amphibious. We chose to survive, and survival required water, so we figured out how to breathe it. Was it dangerous? Yes. Did people die in the early genetic modification trials? Yes. Would we do it again? Absolutely. An engineer from Titan's Reach, his skin darkened by constant exposure to temperature extremes, demonstrated their mobile habitat technology. You can't fight a tidally locked planet. You can't make it spin. So you move instead. We've been migrating in a continuous loop for 180 years. Our entire culture is nomadic now. We don't have permanent cities. We have temporary ones we rebuild every cycle. It works because we made it work. A child from New Sahara, no more than 12, explained their underground fungal farms with the easy confidence of someone who'd never seen the sun. Everyone thinks desert worlds are empty. They're not. They're just selective about what lives there. We're what lives there now. The pattern repeated across every presentation. Humans looked at impossible conditions, acknowledged the impossibility, then did it anyway. During the final evening, Zilara found herself in conversation with Elder Okonkwo, who'd made the journey from New Hope to the symposium venue despite his age. You changed the galaxy's understanding of my species, he said, sipping a beverage carefully formulated for his biochemistry. How does that feel? Zilara considered the question. Terrifying, she admitted. I documented what I saw, but I'm not sure I understand it. Not truly. I can explain the biology, the sociology, the adaptation mechanisms. But the core of it, the choice to keep trying when stopping, would be easier. I don't think my species could make that choice. Maybe, Okonkwo said gently. Or maybe you've never been forced to. The thing about humans isn't that we're braver or stronger or smarter. It's that we've had a lot of practice at surviving things that should kill us. Earth made us that way. Every generation faced some new catastrophe, climate change, predators, disease, resource scarcity, and every generation survived it. We've been playing survival mode for 300,000 years. This, he gestured around them. This is just the latest level. He smiled, that fierce expression Zilara had come to recognize. You want to know the real secret. It's not courage or determination or stubbornness, though we have all those. It's hope. Irrational, illogical, unreasonable hope that tomorrow might be better than today, that our children might live better lives than we did, that all this suffering might mean something. Hope is humanity's most powerful and most dangerous trait. Zilara thought about the memorial gardens, the wall of impossible, the storm festivals. Hope built on graves, she said softly. All hope is built on graves, Okonkwo replied. Every generation stands on the bones of the previous one. The question is whether you honor that foundation or ignore it. We honor it. We remember the cost, and we keep building anyway. The symposium concluded with a joint declaration. the Galactic Death World Initiative, a cooperative program to support colonies on extreme environment planets. Humans would provide expertise and training. Other species would contribute resources, technology, and research support. The goal was to expand the boundaries of habitable space for all species, using humanity's hard-won knowledge as a foundation. It was ambitious. Some said impossible, but Zilara had learned what humans did with impossible. 5 years after her initial visit to the Crucible, Zilara returned. New hope had grown. The population had increased by 800, a combination of births and immigrants, both human and non-human. A small community of Korvax had established themselves in the settlement, using exoframes but slowly adapting. A Thenari xenobotanist had taken up permanent residence, studying the Crucible flora. Even a few Iravani researchers had arrived, drawn by the same fascination that had captured Zilara. Makna met her at the spaceport, older now but still moving with that fluid grace. "Welcome back, Dr. Kess, or should I say Ambassador Kess?" Zilara's recent appointment to the Galactic Council's colonization committee had been big news. "Zilara is fine," she said, emerging from her exoframe. 5 years of research had produced better equipment, but the Crucible was still crushing to non-adapted species. They walked through the settlement, and Zilara noted the changes. New buildings incorporating technology from multiple species. Solar collectors using Thenari efficiency designs. Medical facilities with Iravani diagnostic equipment. Human adaptive techniques merged with galactic technology, creating something new. "We're becoming a crossroads," Makna explained. "People come here to learn, to trade, to challenge themselves. We've had visitors from 47 different species in the last year. Most stay a few weeks, some stay longer, and a few." She gestured to a Korvax working alongside humans to repair a storm wall. "A few decide to stay permanently." "Why?" Zilara asked. "Why would any non-human choose to live here?" Makna smiled. "Same reason we do, because it means something. Because surviving the Crucible proves you can survive anything. Because there's a pride in it, in overcoming what everyone says is impossible. We're not just humans anymore, we're Crucible people. And apparently that's an identity anyone can choose if they're willing to pay the cost." They visited Elder Okonkwo. At 88, he was finally starting to slow, his body accumulating the inevitable damage of living in high gravity for 8 decades. But his mind was sharp, and he greeted Zilara with warm recognition. "Come to see how your tree is doing?" he asked. Zilara blinked in confusion. "My tree?" He led her slowly to a new section of the memorial gardens. There, planted in Crucible soil, was a cutting from her laboratory tree. It had been returned to its home world, growing strong and healthy among the native flora. "You took a piece of us to study," Okonkwo explained. "Seemed right that you should leave a piece of yourself here. That tree represents the bridge between our world and yours, between human stubbornness and galactic wisdom, between impossible and achieved." Zilara felt something shift in her thorax, an emotion her species didn't have a word for. Humans called it being moved, being honored, being connected to something larger than yourself. "Thank you," she said simply. That evening there was another storm festival. Zilara, now experienced enough to trust the shelters, watched through the transparent sections as the Crucible displayed its fury. But this time she didn't feel fear. She felt awe. The humans around her celebrated as they always did, music, dancing, shared food, stories. But now they were joined by Korvax moving stiffly in their exoframes, the Nari membranes vibrating with cautious joy, and Iravani researchers like herself, recording everything but also, finally, participating. Makna found her near the end of the festival. "You're smiling," she observed. "I'm thinking," Zilara replied, "about what you said when I first visited, about humans not conquering worlds but becoming part of them. I think I finally understand. The Crucible changed you, but you also changed it. You brought Earth species here, domesticated native life, altered the ecosystem. It's not the same planet it was 200 years ago." "True," Makna agreed. "But neither are we. That's the deal we made. The planet shapes us, we shape the planet, and we figure out how to coexist. It's not conquest, it's partnership. A violent, difficult, costly partnership, but partnership nonetheless." Zilara looked around at the mixed species gathering, at the human children teaching a young Korvax how to read storm patterns, at the Thanari botanist excitedly explaining local plant chemistry to anyone who'd listen, at Elder Okonkwo telling stories to a multi-species audience, all of them sheltering together from a storm that would kill them all if they were foolish enough to face it alone. "I think," she said slowly, "that's what humanity brings to the galaxy. Not just the ability to survive impossible conditions, but the insistence on turning survival into community. You don't just adapt to death worlds, you make them home. And then you invite everyone else to see what home can be." Makna nodded. "That's the plan. One impossible world at a time." In her laboratory, back at the university, Zilara's crucible tree continued to grow. Its roots ran deep now, anchored in crucible soil that should have been toxic, thriving under conditions that should have killed it. She'd started taking cuttings, distributing them to other researchers, other institutions, other worlds. Each one a reminder that impossible was a suggestion, not a fact. Each one a testament to what could be achieved when stubborn determination met impossible odds. In her final journal entry about the Crucible, Zilara wrote, "I began this research believing I would document an interesting anomaly in human colonial history. I ended it understanding that humans aren't the anomaly. Our assumptions were. We built our civilization on the idea that environments must suit life, never considering that life might suit itself to environments. Humans did consider it. They've been doing it for their entire evolutionary history. Earth was their first crucible, and they've been seeking out new ones ever since. The question is no longer whether humans can survive on death worlds. The answer is yes, given time and determination. The new question is, what does it mean for the galaxy to have a species that refuses to accept limits? What happens when impossibility becomes merely another engineering challenge? I don't have those answers yet, but I know where to look for them. Wherever humans are struggling, adapting, surviving, and eventually thriving against odds that should defeat them. Wherever death worlds are slowly being transformed into homes. Wherever impossible is being redefined as tomorrow's normal. The Crucible taught me that humanity's greatest strength isn't their intelligence or their technology or their physical capabilities. It's their categorical refusal to accept that some challenges cannot be overcome. They look at death and see inconvenience. They face extinction and see opportunity for evolution. They encounter impossible and hear a dare. The galaxy thought the Crucible would be humanity's grave. Humanity turned it into a garden that, more than anything else I've learned, defines what it means to be human. They survive, they adapt, they thrive, and they do it all with an attitude that can best be summarized in 3 words: watch me work.